Hi Year 12, welcome to this lecture looking at how to approach your upcoming sociology mock for the education unit. Just to be aware, I'm going to talk about how to answer all the questions in this paper, including the methods and context paper. However, don't forget your mock won't include the method and context section. So this is what your exam booklet will look like on your mock day, and also what it will look like obviously in your summer exam. As you can see, this is just a specimen paper, so this actually hasn't been released for any uses in exams just yet. You will get an hour and a half for your full exam. Okay, so it's an hour and a half paper. You do not need to bring anything else in with you. It's key that you make sure you use black ink or black ballpoint pen, and you need to make sure that you fill out all the information in the bottom. The key thing with this paper is you must answer all of the questions in the paper, and it's important that you make sure that you only answer questions on education. So this paper is out of 60 marks. You have an hour and a half for this paper, which is 90 minutes. So to work out how long you need to spend on each question, you simply multiply it by 1.5. So for example, if it's a 10-mark question, multiplied by 1.5, you should spend 15 minutes on it. It's quite just important to note that any questions that are worth 10 or more marks, you need to answer in continuous prose, so full sentences. And I would really encourage you, for the 2 marks and the 6-mark questions, I would really encourage you answer to bullet point, because you don't need to write in much detail. AQR are looking for good use of English and organisation of information, and of course you need to apply the specialist concepts where appropriate. So here's the box that you'll be asked to fill out. The centre number for he field is 15604. The candidate number you'll know. You need to write in your surname, your forename, and you also need to sign as well. So let's have a look at You will get two 2-mark questions on your education paper. The first one will ask you to define a particular term, so it's important that you are aware of the key concepts in sociology. So in this case, it's define the term self-fulfilling prophecy. At this stage, you might not be able to answer that because we haven't covered it in the education unit. The key thing here is to be brief. It's only a 2-mark question, should only require 1, maximum 2 sentences. If you really struggle to explain a particular term, sometimes use an example, but you do not need to use an example in order to get the full 2 marks when you are defining a particular term. The second 2-mark question is slightly different. It asks you to use 1 example to briefly explain how cultural deprivation may affect educational achievement. So this is slightly different. You need to be able to explain what cultural deprivation is in your answer, and you need to use an example to illustrate it. The marks are allocated, 1 for the clear understanding of cultural deprivation and the second one for the relevant example. You must be clear, particularly if you get questions about cultural deprivation, that the example you give is to do with culture, not material factors. So good examples of cultural deprivation are things like lack of values in education, and whereas material deprivation is much more about material factors like lack of space at home because they can't afford to live in a big house. So you need to be very clear that your example is correctly linked to what the question is asking you about. You're then going to get a 6-mark question. We've looked at these in lessons, which asks you to outline 3 ways in which something happens, or 3 factors or 3 processes. But the key phrase will be to outline. Now this means to set out the main characteristics and should only really require a sentence or 2 for each point that you make, because it's out of 6. Like I said, the useful thing about this booklet is that they limit the amount of space that you have to answer the question, which should hopefully give you an idea of how much you should be writing. Remember, this is 6 marks, so I would recommend that you use bullet points. So I wouldn't panic about this question. Outline 3 ways in which the organisation of schooling may be ethnocentric, because again, we haven't covered it in too much detail. But just to give you an idea, this is things along the lines of the fact that all school holidays follow the Christian calendar, not other faiths. The food in the canteen, Again, it's British food typically. We don't offer very many halal options, for example. And, like subjects like history, which focus very much on white British history, and we very rarely look at ethnic minorities unless we look at the history of enslaving them, if you like, as well. So that just gives you an idea of how you could answer this question, but don't worry because we haven't covered it in too much depth yet. If we move on to question 4. Now, this is a 10-mark question, and there's another PowerPoint on 10-mark questions, and you should hopefully have a copy of a 10-mark scheme now. This asks you to outline and explain 2 reasons or 2 processes or 2 ways in which normally the starter of the question would be. So in this case, it says outline and explain 2 reasons for gender differences in subject choice. Now, again, we haven't looked at gender, but actually I think most of you should be able to confidently give at least one argument to help you answer this one. Outline and explain basically means to set out the main characteristics of each point and explain it in more detail. Okay, so remember the 10-mark question does carry 2 marks for analysis. Okay, not many marks, but it is asking you to go into things in a bit detail. Outline and explain 2 reasons is asking you for just 2 key points, so 2 quite detailed paragraphs. And I really don't think you can get enough detail or analysis, if you like, unless you use an example to illustrate your point. So I think that's quite important. It's also important to make sure you don't duplicate your response, and make sure you make 2 very distinct points. Okay, so when you think about gender differences in subject choice, you could make the point, one of the reasons for gender differences in subject choice is that some subjects are seen as typically masculine or feminine. For example, sciences are seen as masculine and art is seen as quite feminine. If you then went on to say, then another point saying, it's because some subjects have gendered images. For example, DT is got a masculine image, and food tech's got a feminine image. Those points would be far too similar. So they have to be very distinct and separate points. It's not asking you to evaluate in a 10-mark question. So this is very important. You do not need to criticise the points that you make. It's just asking you to outline and explain 2 reasons for gender differences in subject choice. When you look at the mark schemes, it doesn't refer to studies. It doesn't refer to theoretical perspectives. You don't need to go into that much detail. But obviously, if you can demonstrate your understanding of those, that will contribute to the level of mark you would get in this, I think. Oh, and if you can see that the amount they expect you to write, the best part of a page. So question 5 will always be your 20-mark essay question, and I think it's really important to read the question before you actually read the item, so you know what sort of information to try and pick out. So the question is saying, applying material from item A and your knowledge, evaluate the view that differences in educational achievement between social groups are the result of factors and processes within schools. So there's a few things we just need to quickly look at on this question before we start looking at the item. Firstly, they really have placed a lot of emphasis on the fact that you have to apply material from item A. Okay, this is telling students to draw a material from the item in order to support your answer to this exam question. And the key here really is relevance, okay? Picking out elements from this item that are really going to help you answer this question. And it also says your knowledge. That's also quite important, that the knowledge that you pick is relevant to the question. And so the idea of linking back to the question is quite important here because it does emphasise relevance. The question itself asks you to evaluate the view. So this is going to be a debate question. Obviously, it's always going to be an assess or evaluate question. And it's asking you to look at the differences in achievement between social groups. So I would circle social groups because it's not saying between social classes, genders, ethnicities. It's saying social groups. So this means they don't want you to just talk about class or gender. You have to talk about more than one social group. And this is asking you to evaluate the idea that the reason there's differences in achievement is because of processes within school. So I'd probably underline within quite a few times, because if you start talking about out of school factors, you might not be focusing on the question. So let's have a look at the item. There are important differences in the educational achievement of different social groups. In the views of some sociologists, these differences in achievement are the result of factors and processes within schools. For example, how teachers perceive and treat pupils from different backgrounds can have a major positive or negative effect on their achievement. So straight away, that's a really important line there that we can use. We can develop a whole point on, I think. The fact that teachers and how they treat students can affect how well they do. Processes that we're going to be talking about, things like labelling, teachers labelling or stereotyping certain types of students as really good and academic. Now, do those teachers treat them differently? Do they maybe go to them when they want to answer questions or what have you? Likewise, are there certain types of pupils that teachers tend to treat in a very negative way because they just assume they're going to be a bit rubbish, and we've been looking very much at social class. So do teachers judge working class students as, not as able as maybe the middle class students? And you might need to think about what sorts of things influence teachers' perceptions of students' abilities. And you might want to link it to things like accents we've looked at, how students talk. Behaviour is a big one. It's right the way down to how people even look and, looking at the uniform policy. So that's probably maybe 1 or 2 points maybe we can develop just from that simple line there. Similarly, interactions and relationships among pupils themselves can shape their identities. This can have an important effect on their chances of educational failure or success. So that particular element, is probably referring to subcultures, but it's possibly also referring to things like gendered identities as well. And remember the theory of opposites, the idea that boys will always behave in an opposite way to girls to establish their masculine identity, and likewise girls will behave in a very opposite way to boys to establish their feminine identity. So straight away you can make a point on gender there, but you could also definitely talk about the role of subcultures in how well particular groups do. Now, when we think of subcultures, I know that you know plenty about gender subcultures, particularly anti-school, laddish subcultures or counter-school cultures like Paul Willis. But we also have subcultures that are formed along class lines as well, don't forget. And not to mention, we also have pro-school subcultures. So those are certainly some ideas that you want to be talking about. So when we think about how we've used the item, we've probably managed to pull out maybe 2 or 3 points just from looking at that item. However, this is an evaluate the view question. So you need to be able to present arguments that agree with the question that it is processes within schools that leads to differential achievement among different social groups. But you also have to pick out the other side of the argument. And this needs to be a balanced essay. So I would always suggest for a 20-mark essay, at the very minimum, you need to have 2 points that agree with the question and 2 points that disagree with the question, as well as a well-rounded conclusion. If you are just going to do 4 points, you need to make sure they're quite detailed, or 5 points that may be just a bit less detailed. Don't forget, it's important not to forget how the marks are allocated. So there is 8 marks here for AO1, which is your knowledge and understanding, 6 marks for AO2, which is your application to the question. So that's how you use stuff from the item and your own knowledge. But there's also 6 marks for AO3. So they are looking for you to do some detailed analysis, and they are looking for you to evaluate. And evaluate is the key skill here because that's what it mentions in the item. So do your 2 arguments maybe agreeing with the question, but then you think about the other side of the argument. And in this case, it's going to be the idea that actually educational achievement, differences in educational achievement are not to do with stuff going on inside school. It's more to do with outside of school factors. And that's when you might want to link in things like home life and parental expectations, and maybe parents have language difficulties. But you must remember not to just focus on social class. You must talk about other groups as well. So try and talk about maybe different expectations at home for genders. Like, do parents expect girls to be more academic and hardworking and allow boys to kind of get away with not doing homework because they're playing football? All of those types of arguments. And that should give you a nice, balanced, evaluative essay that's got good evidence of debate. You also need to include a conclusion in order to get to the very top bracket. If you do run out of time in your essay, it is worth mentioning that you can't get 18 or above without a conclusion. So that's just something that you need to remember. If you've only done 2 points, there's no point in then doing a conclusion. It's better to use that time doing a 3rd point, for example. And like I said, I would really recommend you try and get 4 points in there. rather than just sticking a really rubbish conclusion at the end. It's better for you to actually show off what you know and understand and try and analyse that point in a bit of detail, rather than just doing a conclusion that summarises what you've said already. Conclusions, I always recommend, should have some element of a judgment, and you need to explain why you've come down on that particular judgment. Now remember what we've said in class, you need to avoid using I think, I believe, therefore I would argue. Try and think of different, more sophisticated ways to make a conclusion. So you can just simply say, to conclude, it's clear from the evidence that processes in schools are not the only thing that can lead to underachievement among different groups. One thing that's worth mentioning with this particular question is that it does say differences in educational achievement. It doesn't say always underachievement. So you can also explain why particular groups do much better as well. Okay, that's just one thing I thought about for this question. So again, as we scan down, you can see you'll be given in the exam paper in order to answer this. I personally think that's enough. So you should always ask for extra paper in the exam to make sure that you can get into enough detail and depth of discussion with a wide enough range of points to do well and get into the top bracket. So this is the methods in context paper, part of the paper, which again, you don't need to look at right now if you are doing the mock exam, because we're not going to have a methods in context section, although that might change next year. So methods in context, which we've been looking at in class, is very much about getting you to apply your knowledge about a particular research method back to the specific context mentioned in the question. So let's have a look at the question before we look at the item. Applying material from item B and your knowledge of research methods, evaluate the strengths and limitations of using self-completion written questionnaires to investigate unauthorised absences from school. And this is out of 20 marks. First things first, please make sure you write somewhere on this paper PET to make sure that you look out for practical issues, ethical issues and theoretical issues. And remember, theoretical issues includes the positivism, interpretivism debate, but also theoretical issues include things like validity, representativeness and reliability. So write that down somewhere and get ready to try and find evidence from the item that will help you with the PET. So this is all about investigating unauthorised absences from school. There is a close correlation between frequent unauthorised absence from school and educational underachievement. Those pupils who are not doing well at school are more likely to truant. Similarly, those who truant regularly are likely to finish their school career with poor qualifications. Pupils may be absent without authorisation for many reasons, from caring responsibilities at home or dislike of school to parents arranging family holidays in term time. Sociologists may use self-completion written questionnaires to study unauthorised absences. These can be distributed easily to a large number of pupils, parents or teachers. The findings of the questionnaires can also be used to establish patterns and trends in relation to unauthorised absences. However, self-completion questionnaires often have very low response rates, especially when they ask about sensitive issues. So pick out your PET issues if you can from that final paragraph. The fact that they're talking about how easily it is to distribute written questionnaires to pupils, parents and teachers, that's obviously a practical issue. And the fact they're mentioning that questionnaires can establish patterns and trends, that's clearly a theoretical issue, because that's what positivists look like. They want to find patterns and trends. However, it does mention low response rate. Straight away, if you've got a low response rate, you know that's going to impact your representativeness, okay, which is a theoretical issue. So far we've got our P and our T from the item, especially when they ask about sensitive issues. Straight away, sensitive issues, that's some type of ethical issue. So, for example, this is asking you to carry out an investigation into unauthorised absences from school. You need to explain why that might be a sensitive issue. So, for example, if pupils are caring for parents at home, that might be a sensitive issue for them to discuss. They might not want to admit to that. They might be embarrassed about that. And some pupils might be worried that they might be taken into care if that's found out. Now, if you can make that argument as a criticism of using self-completion written questionnaires, that's really well focused to the context here. And that's the key thing. You must apply every strength or weakness you discuss to the exact context, which is investigating unauthorised absences from school. So again, when you look at the practical issues, you can argue it's really good that you can hand out these sort of questionnaires to pupils, parents and teachers, But remember, teachers are really, really busy. You can maybe link this even closer back to unauthorised absences from school, because you might want to link it to the idea that teachers stereotype and label certain students negatively, so they might be more likely to lie or be critical of particular students and why they might truant, and that can affect the validity of your findings. One of the key issues, particularly for this type of topic, is I suppose social desirability. If you're giving questionnaires out to parents, particularly parents who might have young people who do truant, if you like, or have unauthorised absences, are these parents going to tell the truth? And if they don't tell the truth, that's going to affect the validity of your findings. And when we think again about response rate, what sorts of parents are going to want to fill out the questionnaires, okay? Because you can't force parents to fill out questionnaires. And if it is only literally those parents that have got, like, you know, the that have the cultural capital, that buy into education and value it, then you're not going to get a representative view from the parents of the students who might be more likely to truant or have unauthorised absences. You need to make sure that you link your points back very strongly to the context. So as you can see, I keep on talking about truancy. I keep on thinking about, well, how might this method be a bit rubbish to investigate this particular topic? Obviously, you've got to give a balanced argument as well, because it says strengths and limitations, and we focus very much on the limitations there. Although we did mention the strengths of finding quite useful patterns. You might argue, because these are self-completion questionnaires and they can complete them maybe privately, they might be more likely to be honest about the real causes of truancy. However, if you get students to fill out questionnaires in classrooms, you can't guarantee things like confidentiality. Again, and if they don't want to admit to unauthorised absences because it is a bit of a deviant behaviour, you're not going to get people being honest in these self-completion written questionnaires. You can push this method up against other ones to demonstrate another one that might be more appropriate, but you need to do that in order to highlight the weakness of the method discussed. So you might say, self-completion written questionnaires, it's much easier for parents to lie about why their young person didn't come to school that day. However, if you did try to use something like an interview, the parents might find it more difficult to lie because they're sitting in front of the interviewer, for example. Again, you can't go off into a whole point about interviews, but you can mention it to highlight a weakness of the self-completion written questionnaire. So when they mark, they look out for PET. So if you mention practical issues, ethical issues, and theoretical issues, and if you use conceptual detail, so thinking about all those pervert words, practical, ethical, theoretical, in positivism, interpretivism, reliability, representativeness, validity, Verstehen, all those different words. If you can use some of them to help you answer this question, you're going to get good marks. Don't ever say a method is reliable and valid, because that's what the examiner hates. Make sure you distinguish between methods that are reliable, which means it's easy to replicate and standardise and get the same results as someone else did the same study, and validity, which is when you're more likely to get to the truth of the matter. Methods that are reliable are generally not considered very valid, so please do not ever say this is a reliable and valid method. That is not the right way of using the word reliability. And I would recommend you write at least 2 sides of A4 for this, which is pretty much what they give you in the exam booklet. Some of you got bigger writing, however, so do request another bit of paper if you do need it. Thank you for listening, Year 12, and good luck in your exam.